Welcome to the Down the Spirituality and Science Rabbit Hole podcast number 7. The title is Jesus' Trial and Crucifixion, the Shroud of Turin's Medical Evidence. This medical evidence consists primarily of blood and bodily fluids that were deposited onto the shroud by the dead body that was inside it. Now, if you haven't watched podcast number 4, that one is an introduction to the Shroud of Turin and the Serum of Oviedo, and this particular podcast is a second in a series of podcasts on the Shroud and the Serum. Now, let me make one point very clear. A real dead body produced the Shroud's medical evidence. Not only that, it's a dead body in rigor mortis. The Shroud is not possibly a photograph for reasons which we'll go into on another podcast, nor is it a painting. Now, about 40 years ago, there was a very vigorous debate over whether the image on the Shroud could have been a painting, but that's basically been thoroughly disproved. There's no evidence that the image on the Shroud or anything on the Shroud was put there by painting. More importantly, a real dead body, consistent with all the trauma described in the Crucifixion of Jesus, had to actually be placed in the shroud to transfer the bodily fluids to the shroud. If the shroud is a forgery, someone had to die to make it. That someone also had to be crucified in accordance with the gospel accounts. Now, to start off, I thought it would be helpful to look at one of the gospel accounts to sort of set the stage for all the medical evidence we're going to be looking at here. You'll notice in this I've selected the Gospel of John, which seems to me to have the most detailed and probably the most accurate account of the trial and the crucifixion, although it is in the 3 synoptic Gospels as well. Notice that I have highlighted parts of that beginning and at the end in red, which are relevant to the medical evidence. And I will read the beginning and the end here to kind of set the stage. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they clothed him in a purple robe. And they were coming up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Going down now to the end of the passage, Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he, bearing his own cross, went out to what is called Skull Place, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him and 2 others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the center. Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. It read, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." So from the first part, we see that Pilate had Jesus scourged. They then made a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they then struck him repeatedly, most likely in the face. Moving down to the end, it said that they took Jesus out to be crucified at a place called Golgotha, and that he had to carry the cross to that place. And they crucified him with 2 others. Notice John does not say they were thieves. The Romans only crucified people that were politicals, revolutionaries. They would never crucify a common thief or a common criminal. It was reserved for political offenses against Rome, mainly because it was such a horrible way to die. John takes the middle ground here and simply said there were 2 others. He doesn't identify them as thieves. Finally, on the plaque, he puts Jesus the Nazarene, not Jesus of Nazareth. As we've talked about before, the town of Nazareth probably did not even exist at the time of Jesus, according to archaeology, but Jesus was possibly an Essene of the Nazarite or the Nazarene variety, and his name was Jesus the Nazarene, not Jesus of Nazareth. The photographic negative here show the frontal and dorsal shroud body images. Bloodstains, which are dark on the actual shroud, show as light or white in the negative image. Medical doctors and forensic scientists have studied the body images on the shroud for more than 100 years. Intense forensic evaluation of the shroud began as soon as the photographic negatives of the first photographs taken by Secundo Pia were released to the public in 1898. The negative images show the wounds and blood flows in great detail. The image on the shroud shows a naked, scourged, and crucified man. Forensic calculations and experimental draping of volunteer subjects in a model of the shroud cloth indicate the man had a height of approximately 5 feet and 10 inches and a weight of approximately 170 pounds. The body is anatomically well developed and normal. The body is considered tall for a first-century Judean Jew. However, findings from a first-century cemetery excavation near the wall of the temple in Jerusalem include remains of individuals approaching 6 feet. There are also many indications that the man was Jewish. Mark Antonaki's 2015 book on the shroud include the following summary supporting the man of the shroud's Jewish identity. And I quote, "There are many indications that the man was Jewish. His physiognomy is Jewish. He had a beard and his hair was shoulder length, parted in the middle and caught into a ponytail at the back of his head. All traits found in Jewish men of antiquity. The man of the shroud appears to have been buried with a chin band around his jaw, a proper Jewish burial custom to keep the mouth closed in death. In addition, his burial posture matches that of skeletons found at the first-century Jewish cemetery of Qumran. The use of a single linen shroud is also consistent with ancient Jewish burial practices, as is the custom of not washing the body of a victim of violent death in which blood that flowed during life and after death is present." This last point is very important. Normally, a Jewish body after death is washed before it is buried. However, the exception to that is if the person experienced a violent death and there is blood on the body. The Jews distinguish between blood that flows out of the body while you're alive and that which flows after you're dead. The body of the person in the shroud would have had both types on him, so the body was not washed before it was put into the shroud, which caused it to deposit the bodily fluids onto the shroud. If the body had been washed, there would be very little medical evidence on the shroud. There are multiple traumatic injuries from the scourging of both the front and the back of the body image. The injuries shown on the dorsal image start at the shoulders, continue down across the buttocks, and down the backs of the legs. Many of the scourge marks, when illuminated by ultraviolet light, show fine scratches not otherwise visible to the naked eye. In some cases, 3 or 4 parallel scratches can be distinguished in areas of the dumbbell-shaped scourge wounds. The forensic evidence shows that the beating was very severe and unrestrained. It was, however, stopped before the victim died from the beating. At a minimum, the beating would have left the victim in shock. The most acute counts of the wounds associated with the scourging is 372 total individual wounds, 159 on the front of the body and 213 on the back. Now, unlike the image in the upper left-hand side here of the individual being scourged, the man in the shroud was naked when he was scourged. Note the marks on the back image below the waist. However, the image shown here does reproduce well the fact that there were probably two individuals who were responsible for the beating, one on either side of the person who was tied to a post, and they would alternate it in terms of whipping one versus the other. This is consistent with the angle that you find for these scourge marks on the shroud. They do indicate that there were two people involved and they were alternating at an angle. Many of the scourge wounds are consistent with those that would be inflicted by whipping with an instrument of torture known as a Roman flagrum. Studies of the shroud image have led to the hypothesis that the flagrum used in the scourging consisted of 3 separate strips of leather, each ending in a set of 2 weighted iron balls. The metal balls would tear the flesh of the victim. There are scratches in the flesh that appear in the area of the dumbbell-shaped wounds. These scratches are only visible when illuminated with ultraviolet light. Study of historical artifacts of the Roman Empire from the 1st century revealed that a typical flagrum consisted of a wooden handle measuring approximately 8 inches long, while the leather strips were of varying lengths to prevent the metal balls from striking each other when the flagrum was swung, and thus inadvertently shedding energy before impacting with the flesh of the victim. Some shroud forensic scientists have used the imputed angles of the wounds on the upper back of the body to suggest that 2 individuals, and they actually figured that one was taller than the other, stood behind and to either side of the victim to administer the beating. The severity of the beating could have easily caused a partial or complete collapse of a lung, but even if this were not the case, just breathing after the brutal nature of the beating would likely have been excruciatingly painful. As you see in the lower picture here, there appear to be wounds with an instrument that had 2 beads and another with 3 beads. So it's possible that one individual had a 2-beaded flagrum and the other individual had a 3-beaded one. There are multiple puncture wounds encircling the entire skull area. This finding is consistent with the crown of thorns that we read about in John's Gospel that are traditionally associated with this part of the story. There is a distinct pattern of blood flows associated with the wounds, especially visible on the forehead. Now again, something that is unique to the shroud indicates that this crown was more like a cap that's depicted here that basically pushed thorns down into not just around the sides of the head, but at the top of the head. Most of the art that we see about the Passion shows the crown of thorns as a circlet, but that's not what's indicated here with the man in the shroud. It is a complete cap that covered the top of the head, which would have been far more painful. We see here a typical artist's depiction of the crucifixion. And like almost all artist depictions of the crucifixion, it is highly sanitized. The shroud tells a story of torture, brutalization, and extreme trauma to the body. You don't see any of that in historical depictions of the crucifixion. Here, let me just go down the list of what's wrong with this picture. First of all, as we'll talk about shortly, the cross is wrong. The cross would not have looked like this. The titulus, which is the plaque above Jesus, is in the wrong place here. Also, the nails are in the wrong place. They're in the palms of the hands. You cannot support a crucified person's weight with nails through the palms. They would rip out. Also, the crown of thorns, as we just discussed, is not a circlet. It's a cap. Also, there are no scourge marks on this particular depiction. Also, he's wearing a loincloth. For almost all of the trial and carrying the cross and the crucifixion, Jesus would have been naked. He would not even have had a loincloth. The whole purpose of Roman crucifixion was to humiliate the individual in front of their peers. So Jesus would have hung on the cross totally naked. Also, if you kind of look carefully here, this man looks more Eastern European than he does Jewish. So just what was Roman crucifixion? Well, it was a form of capital punishment and probably the worst possible way someone could die. The cause of death in crucifixion is suffocation. From hanging on the cross, you can't breathe properly. But it takes days to kill you. So we're looking at two pictures here. The one on the left is the way the church and most people think of the cross that Jesus was crucified on. It was not. The Romans did not use the Latin cross for one simple reason. It's too difficult. You would have to lay that cross on the ground, lay the person on top of it, nail them to it, then lift up the cross and the person to stick it in the ground. Assuming the person weighs between 180 to 200 pounds, the wood is considerably heavy too. It's just too darn difficult to use a cross like that. On the right, you see the crosses that the Romans would have used. You see they look like a T. And that would allow them to basically nail the crossbeam to the hands, and then they just have to lift that up and put it on top of the stipes, which is the upright part of it, which is probably already in the ground. I think this picture here is literally a scene from Spartacus at the end of the movie. You can see how this would be a deterrent to people from rebelling against Rome. These people would have hung on the cross for days. Even after they had died, the Romans would leave them up there until literally the body rotted off of the cross. As you can see here with the picture at the top, there are abrasions on both the right and left shoulder and across the nape of the neck. These abrasions are consistent with injuries that would have been inflicted by carrying the crosspiece, typically called a patibulum. You see a picture of that here in the center. Research indicates a patibulum might weigh approximately 60 pounds, but it could weigh as much as 100 pounds. The entire cross might weigh as much as 175 pounds. If the condemned carried just the patibulum, it would be laid behind the head across the shoulders with the arms outstretched and secured to the patibulum, usually with ropes. The reason why Jesus probably wouldn't have carried the entire cross is because for Roman executions, the upright part of the cross, called the stipes, was usually permanently inserted into the ground. The places that were places of execution had these stipes already in the ground, and the condemned person would have to carry the patibulum or the crossbeam to the cross. In the center of this picture here, you see a typical cross. It's shaped like a T. And the way the Romans would do this, a crucifixion team for the Romans usually consisted of 3 people, 2 soldiers and 1 centurion. And usually it was the soldiers that did all the work while the centurion just kind of stood to the side and supervised. What they would have done is nailed your hands to the patibulum, Then the two soldiers would have lifted the cross, one on either side of you, and simply hefted it up and laid it on top of a flat pace on the stipes. So this is how they would have gotten them up on the cross. You can see that Pilate's titulus, or the plaque that he put there, would have been attached to the patibulum, since there is no Latin cross that would have something extending up past the crosspiece. So you're probably wondering what the little footstool is there on the cross, the thing that's called the settle. That was actually a place where they could, after they nailed their feet, the feet rested on top of this. Why? It's not an act of mercy giving them some place to stand. The only way you could keep yourself alive when you were crucified, you would literally have to push up with your feet to lift you up on the cross to allow your chest enough space to expand to breathe. So picture yourself nailed to a cross here. Every time you had to take a breath, you would have to literally use your legs and lift yourself up so your diaphragm could function, and then you could collapse back to your resting position. Imagine how many times you'd have to do that before you would become thoroughly exhausted. Death usually occurred after you were so tired you could no longer push yourself up. You hung on the cross, and eventually you suffocated because you couldn't breathe. There is a braiding and denuding of skin in the knee area on the shroud. This injury is consistent with a fall. There is a swelling associated with the contusion of the knee, and some forensic doctors have suggested the swelling is consistent with a fracture of the kneecap bone. So as we've talked about before, Jesus probably didn't carry the entire cross as it's depicted here. He would have had the patibulum tied and to his extended arms. This means that there was nothing protecting you from a fall. The only thing you could use to break any type of fall would be your knees, and possibly even falling on your face, because there'd be no arms available to outstretch and break your fall. There's considerable facial trauma on the shroud image. The nose image on the shroud appears to be distorted. There is swelling on both cheeks, a triangular wound on the right cheek, and according to several forensic medical experts, the nose is swollen and deviated. In other words, he has a broken nose. If the condemned man carried the patibulum across his shoulders with his outstretched arms secured with ropes, there would be no way to protect the face when falling. This is one explanation for the facial injuries. Lesions and abrasions have also been found on the front of the man's knees, as we described before, as well as there is dirt on the knees and the nose, which is evidence supporting the hypothesis that the man fell to the ground while carrying an object across his shoulders. Another explanation for the facial wounds is that the man in the shroud was beaten about the face, as we read about in the Gospel of John. Both these explanations working together might also explain all of the facial injuries. The act of crucifixion included nailing the hands of the condemned with his arm outstretched to the patibulum. The word excruciate means to torment or torture, and excruciating means extreme pain or anguish. Both words come from the same Latin root as does the word crucifixion. The nailing shown on the shroud is consistent with the established method Roman used for crucifixion. The entry wounds may have been in the palm area close to the wrist or in the wrist area itself. The exact entry point of the nail is conjecture because only the back of the left hand is visible on the shroud. The exit wound appears to be in the wrist. It is known from tests with cadavers that nailing through only the palms of the hands is not sufficient to support the weight of the human body. The experiment showed that the hand would tear free from the nail due to the weight of the body, particularly if there was additional dynamic forces imposed by repetitive or violent movement of an actually crucified person. Some forensic scientists have suggested that to guarantee fixing a person to the cross would require penetrating the bone structure of the wrist area with the impaling nail. The typical Roman nail used in crucifixion was made of iron with a gradually tapering four-sided shaft. Nails might be up to at least 7 inches long, and they had a large rounded head. If you take a look at the crucifixion nail here, you see it has a very large head on it. This is to prevent the crucified person from pulling his hands free by making an outward motion and pulling them over the end of the nail. That can't be done if the nail has a huge flat head on the end of it. So here you see a better representation on the left. Position A is where most artists show the nail going through the hands during Jesus' crucifixion. As you can see, there's only a flap of skin in between the two finger bones that are holding the nail in place, and the weight of the body would just rip through that. The only place you can put a crucifixion nail is in position B, either between the radius and ulna bones, or you can see there are several fused bones in the wrist area there to the left of the letter B. You could also put the nail through those bones there. You can see over on the right a better depiction of where the nail went on the wrist. There's also several nerves that run through there, which we're going to talk about in the next picture. The image on the shroud shows only the 4 fingers of each hand. The thumbs are folded under the palm. Some forensic scientists think that the traumatic puncture wounds of the crucifixion nails through the wrists would have damaged nerves, causing the thumbs to rotate in towards the palm underneath the hand. Barbet reported on the results of experiments he performed during 1932 through 1935 on freshly amputated hands as chief surgeon of St. Joseph's Hospital in Paris. And I quote, "Now dissections have revealed to me that the trunk of the median nerve is always seriously injured by the crucifixion nail. It is divided into sections, being broken sometimes halfway and sometimes 2/3 of the way across, according to the case." He continues, "Christ must then have agonized and died and have become fixed in the cadaverous rigidity with the thumbs bent inwards into his palms. And that is why on the shroud, the 2 hands, when seen from behind, only show 4 fingers, and why the 2 thumbs are hidden in the palms." As we've mentioned before, the main cause of death in crucifixion is suffocation. Here you see pictures of the 2 positions that you have to assume in order to push up. The picture on the right shows the individual pushing up with his legs to allow his rib cage to expand and the diaphragm to be freed in order to take a breath. And then after that's done, the picture on the left shows him slumping down into a position that doesn't require any effort to lift up. Normally, the person dies when they become so fatigued they can no longer lift up and they suffocate. The exact cause of death of the man in the shroud is disputed. There is an image on the shroud showing the wounds of the condemned, scourged, and crucified victim in great detail that can be studied forensically, but there is no body available for a full autopsy. Nevertheless, the weight of the forensic work tends to favor a judgment that death resulted from a combination of hypovolemic shock and traumatic shock, from the scourging and then the crucifixion. Hypovolemic shock, also known as hemorrhagic shock, results when you lose more than 20% of your body's blood or fluid supply from bleeding or severe sweating. If untreated, hypovolemic shock can result in the heart being unable to pump a sufficient amount of blood to the body, and then death shortly follows. It is to be noted that Jesus died quickly on the cross, within 3 hours. I mentioned before how victims of crucifixion would last for days, probably because of the scourging and the carrying the cross, and all of that combined left him in a very weakened state and in shock. Therefore, he succumbed to both shock and most likely suffocation. The shroud shows that gravity affected the blood flow associated with the wound to the left wrist. The alignment of the blood flow relative to the direction of gravity has been used forensically to show that the arms were raised at an angle of approximately 20 degrees from the horizontal, while the man was suspended on the cross, and that the shoulders were likely dislocated. Hanging in this position would lead to extreme pain in the shoulders and the arms. Also, the chest would be stretched and thus compressed. Breathing would be difficult. The remedy would be to push up on the impaled feet in order to gain some relief for breathing. One agony would be joined to another. Movement to gain any respite would cause exhaustion and profuse sweating. There would be no middle ground where the agony were to subside. The left image shows a close-up of the back of the left hand and forearm. The right image shows the left arm rotated to the approximate angle from the horizontal of the arm when the body was in the crucifixion position. In this image, you can see how gravity might have affected the direction of the blood flows on the wrist and the forearm. The forensic evidence is consistent with the feet being nailed to the cross. The details of precisely how the feet were nailed to the cross are open to interpretation. One interpretation is that one foot was placed on top of the other foot, and then a single nail was driven through both feet into the crucifixion post. Archaeological finds in Jerusalem have shown that in other cases the feet were turned to the side and nailed through the heels with a long single nail. In either case, the nailing of the feet would have been excruciatingly painful. The blood flows on the shroud appear to be consistent with either method of nailing the feet. So let's return again to the Gospel of John to finish up the crucifixion. The important part I've again highlighted in red. I'll start at verse 30 here. So when he had received the vinegar, Jesus said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Therefore, because it was the day of preparation, that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. Two important points. Jesus' legs were not broken because he was already dead, and they pierced his side with a spear as a test to see if he was actually dead. The shroud image shows no evidence that the legs of the victim were broken. The legs of a crucifixion victim were sometimes broken or significantly injured in order to cause rapid death. The breaking of the legs would remove the ability of the victim to distribute weight on the impaled feet and push up to aid in breathing. Also, the fracturing blows would cause additional severe traumatic shock, and death would come quickly. If it were known the shroud victim were already dead, then there would have been no need to break the legs, only the need to test to see if he actually was dead by piercing his side. The shroud image shows a wound to the right chest area. The image of the back of the body, the dorsal image, also shows a large volume of blood and fluid from this wound pooling under the back of the body as it lay in the shroud. The weight of forensic evidence shows that the wound to his right side of the chest was post-mortem. A post-mortem thrust of a lance into the thoracic cavity, delivered to ensure that the crucifixion victim was dead, is consistent with the release of blood and a massive pleural effusion of fluid from the area surrounding the heart. The fluid would have been accumulated because of the trauma of the brutal scourging, coupled with the trauma of being crucified. The blood on the shroud has been shown to be human blood. In 1978, during testing in Turin, the stirrup team collected tape samples from the shroud, including samples from the alleged blood areas. Stirrup biophysicist John Heller and chemist Alan Alder studied the samples and collaborated in publishing a report in 1980 in which they confirmed the presence of the actual blood on the shroud. In 1981, Heller and Adler extended their research to include serological techniques that involve the diagnostic identification of two major blood serum proteins, albumin and immunoglobulin. They used these results on tests to conclude that the blood is primate human blood. In more recent studies, such stains were shown to belong to the MNS positive individual of the AB blood group, and the halos surrounding the blood stains were compatible with serum containing trace amounts of bilirubin, albumin, and immunoglobulins. The AB positive blood type is so rare to the point of only 4% of the general population. And this is because the statistical probability of a person inheriting the A blood allele from one parent and the B blood allele from another parent is very small. Someone who died of hypervolemic shock would have had a tremendous amount of fluid in the chest cavity. So when it was pierced by the spear, both blood and fluid came out, or as John, the Gospel of John mentions, water, which would have, the serum fluid would have appeared as water. And you can see it pooled in the back of the shroud. After the victim was laid in it, water and blood continued to come out of this wound and pooled along the small of the back. So, here ends the end of the medical evidence that's on the shroud. And I think you'll agree it is quite extensive and compelling. There are a number of unusual aspects of Jesus' crucifixion. The first is he was scourged prior to the crucifixion. This is not normally done by the Romans. They normally don't scourge someone and then crucify him. Why? Because exactly what happened to Jesus. They died too quickly and they wouldn't suffer enough. So the combination of scourging as well as crucifixion is somewhat unusual in Jesus' case. As we mentioned before, because of all the trauma, he died quickly in about 3 hours. He was lanced afterwards to test to see if he was actually dead. Normally, the Romans would not lance somebody to test if they were dead. This appears to be somewhat unusual in Jesus' case. As we mentioned before, the legs were not broken because he died so quickly. His blood and other body fluids were transferred to the shroud. This is kind of unusual in and of itself. And lastly, there is no sign of clot-to-cloth adhesion on the shroud. This will become more important in a later podcast. The fact that we don't see any evidence of clotting adhesion to the shroud and the blood group will become extremely important when we get to comparing the shroud and the sudarium. So that will conclude this particular podcast on the medical evidence.